The greatest kingdom in Western history, the golden age of Camelot, the very idea of chivalry itself. It did not begin with a glorious prophecy or a divine announcement. It began with a lie so profound, so unforgivable, that it shattered the very foundations of ancient Britain before the first stone of the Round Table was ever hammered into place. Can you believe that the legendary King Arthur, the symbol of justice and light, was born from a catastrophe no one saw coming? A violent act of deception, dictated by volcanic, consuming lust, and orchestrated by the most terrifying sorcerer to ever walk the earth. This is not the sanitized, gentle myth you think you know. This is the true, brutal history of 5th century Britain, a desolate landscape where magic was real, chaos reigned supreme, and men, even kings, were nothing more than monsters fighting for scraps of power. Picture the world immediately after the colossal shadow of Rome retreated, leaving behind a power vacuum so immense it felt like the very earth was screaming. Britain had dissolved into a nightmare of fragmented territories, constantly assaulted by merciless Saxon and Pictish hordes. Civilization was clinging to the cliffs by its fingernails, and only one man possessed the raw magnetic power to hold the abyss at bay: Uther Pendragon, the High King. Uther was a figure of staggering might, a scarred warrior whose presence alone could rally armies. Yet his reign was poisoned by a singular, fatal flaw. It was an obsession that burned hotter than any dragon's breath, an unholy desire for a woman he could never, under any circumstance, possess. Her name was Igraine, the Duchess of Cornwall, a woman renowned throughout the fractured island not just for her striking, untouchable beauty, but for her fierce, uncompromising loyalty to her husband, Gorlos, the powerful Duke of Cornwall. Gorlos was one of Uther's most crucial and necessary allies, yet Uther's lust quickly transcended any sense of political necessity or honor. He demanded her. He tried to seize her. But Gorlos, a man of pride, saw the insult for what it was, a declaration of war against his very soul. In a move of ultimate defiance, the Duke snatched Igraine away and barricaded them both within his two formidable strongholds, Terrible and the legendary coastal fortress of Tintagel. This act was the immediate trigger for the downfall of peace. Uther, now blind with incandescent rage and desire, laid a desperate siege against Gorlois. But traditional siege warfare was slow, agonizingly slow, and Uther's patience had evaporated entirely. He needed instant access. He needed a miracle. Or perhaps he needed a devil's bargain. He found both in the whispering shadows of the court, in the ancient, unblinking eyes of the one man whose power transcended all mortal law, Merlin, the last great sorcerer of Britain. Merlin knew the price of meddling with fate. He saw the future, the glory of the kingdom Arthur would build, but also the inevitable, agonizing catastrophe of its collapse. Yet, when Uther promised him anything, every jewel, every land, the sorcerer agreed to the dark pact. The chilling price? The child born of that night's deception, the firstborn son, would be surrendered immediately to Merlin, to be raised in secret, far from the toxic corruption of the court. Uther, thinking only of Igraine and the immediate fulfillment of his volcanic passion, agreed without a second thought, sealing a contract written in the cold ink of inescapable fate. He had just sold the future of Britain for one night of forbidden pleasure. Under the cloak of a storm so violent it felt like the gods themselves were weeping, Merlin wove the most sophisticated and terrifying magical illusion ever recorded. Uther Pendragon was physically transformed, down to the last recognizable scar, the exact height, the precise tone of voice, into the perfect, flawless likeness of Duke Gorlois. While Uther's armies pretended to launch a fierce, distracting assault against the battlements of Terrabil, drawing Gorlois's attention to the conflict, the real High King, disguised as her husband, slipped into the seemingly impregnable Tintagel, the sanctuary where Igraine lay, mourning her husband's peril. Imagine the moment, a knock in the dead of night. Igraine, overwhelmed with relief that her husband had returned, safe from the fighting, welcomed him with open arms, embracing the man she loved, completely unaware that she was pressing herself against the ruthless monarch who coveted her crown and her body. The magical deception was flawless, the night was long, and in that moment of profound, catastrophic trickery, the seed of the greatest king Britain would ever know was planted, conceived under the banner of a fundamental, magical lie. When the dawn finally broke, the spell dissolved. Uther, satiated and deeply shaken by the magnitude of his own deceit, received the news that Gorlois had, ironically and conveniently, been slain in the siege at Terrabil. The timing was too perfect, too suspicious for anyone who dared look closely. Uther swiftly consolidated his victory, then returned to Tintagel to claim the grieving widow, Igraine, and the now vacant Duchy of Cornwall. She had no choice but to marry him, now Queen of Britain, forever haunted by the inexplicable memory of the night her dead husband had miraculously returned. Igraine was pregnant, carrying the child conceived under the most devastating lie in British history, and as the pregnancy advanced, Merlin came to collect his dreadful payment. The boy, the hidden prince, the one who would become the once and future king, was ruthlessly stripped from his mother's arms and whisked away into the shadows, his true identity a secret guarded by the very ancient forces of the earth itself. The betrayal was complete, and the price was monstrously high. Uther Pendragon, the Lion of Britain, had secured his heir, a son forged in the crucible of lies. But he was instantly forced to realize that ownership of this child was fleeting. Merlin, the architect of this unholy transaction, materialized in the sterile silence of the delivery room, his eyes twin shards of ancient ice, demanding the fulfillment of the pact made in shadows. The child, barely hours old, still slick with the burden of his fraudulent origin, had to be surrendered. It was the crucial contingency, the magical insurance policy against the chaos Uther's reign had already guaranteed. Merlin knew that if this child, born of a king who stole another man's wife through sorcery, remained within the poisoned walls of the court, he would be murdered by the vengeful, the ambitious, or the morally outraged. The risk was not just to Arthur. The risk was to the future of Britain itself, which Merlin, through his terrifying foresight, knew depended entirely on this nameless babe surviving the darkness. Igraine, heartbroken by the cold revelation of her husband's deceit and the instant loss of her true firstborn, was left weeping in the grand haunted halls of Tintagel, a queen suddenly stripped bare of dignity and motherhood. Imagine the scene. Uther, usually a whirlwind of rage and command, stood paralyzed, watching the future of Britain, wrapped in coarse wool, snatched away by the man who had just enabled his greatest sin. He raged internally, but the power of the sorcerer held him shackled. The child was not merely being hidden, he was being wiped from the history books, erased from the royal ledger until the time was right, a time Merlin alone would determine. The baby Arthur was swiftly handed to Sir Ector, a loyal, if minor, nobleman, far removed from the treacherous central court. Ector was a man whose honor was as solid as the rocky ground beneath his feet, and importantly, he was a man who already had a young son named Kay. He was trustworthy, discreet, and crucially, poor enough in status to remain invisible to the grand machinations of the court. Ector and his wife were given one instruction, terrifying in its simplicity. Raise this boy as your own, name him Arthur, and never, under the threat of agonizing death, reveal his true bloodline. The magical compulsion woven into Merlin's command ensured absolute obedience. This was the dark paradox. The once and future king, the man destined to unite the fractured realm, was raised not in a golden cradle, but in the muddy, mundane security of a minor country manor, believing he was the younger, unremarkable son of a simple knight. He knew nothing of the dragon blood pumping beneath his skin, nothing of the castle walls that should have been his home, nothing of the horrific, magical deception that stained his birth. He grew up fetching water, learning to ride a pony, and constantly living in the shadow of his boastful, older foster brother Kay. He was a boy without a past, utterly unaware that the most powerful wizard in the world checked on him periodically from the shadows, ensuring his survival until the stars aligned. Meanwhile, back in the capital, the stain of Tintagel spread like a mortal plague. The nobles whispered, the knights grew restless, and the brutal reality of 5th century Britain began to assert itself with savage force. Uther, consumed by the moral weight of his actions and the instant loss of his child, grew increasingly erratic and tyrannical. The very foundation of his rule, legitimacy and moral authority, had been hollowed out. His focus fractured, and the external enemies, those ravening wolves known as the Saxons, saw their opportunity. The Saxons were not some grand, structured army. They were terrifyingly efficient bands of raiders, opportunistic and relentless, hitting the soft underbelly of Britannia, burning monasteries, stealing cattle, and leaving trails of slaughter from coast to coast. Uther was spending his strength fighting 1,000 brush fires, desperate to maintain the fragile peace Constantine had established. But his heart was hollowed out. The strength of a king is derived from his legitimacy, and Uther had paid his legitimacy to Merlin for one night of passion. The price was finally coming due. The battles became harder, the loyalty of his troops became suspect, and the exhaustion of ruling a unified state in the Dark Ages began to crush him like a millstone. He fought bravely, often leading the charge, draped in the armor of a lion, but the fire in his soul had dimmed. Uther Pendragon, the mighty warrior who wrestled power from chaos, died vomiting blood, alone and unmourned in his own fortress. His death was not a transition, it was an explosion. The moment the breath left his body, the fragile structure of unified Britain shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. The great lords immediately stopped fighting Saxons and started fighting each other. Every duke, every petty chieftain, every ambitious general declared themselves the rightful heir to the now vacant throne. The land descended into the horrific period known simply as the Time of Troubles, a decade of endless internecine warfare, famine, and terror that threatened to extinguish the light of civilization entirely. Britain was a severed head rolling in the mud, and there was no hand strong enough to pick it up. The legend of the glorious King Arthur was still just a secret held by a handful of people and a boy playing in the fields of a forgotten estate. The throne was vacant, the symbol of kingship lost, and the realm was drowning. This state of utter despair, this absolute absence of hope, was the precise, terrifying condition that Merlin had been waiting for. It was time for the foundational lie to become the foundational truth. The stage was set for the impossible challenge that would summon the true king from the shadows, a challenge involving stone, steel, and a destiny that defied the very laws of men. Merlin knew that only in absolute desperation would the arrogant nobles accept a king not of their choosing. The solution he devised was simple, audacious, and completely reliant on divine intervention, or the illusion of it. The king must be chosen by God, not by men. And the method? A miracle of unmatched spectacle that would forever change the course of history. The king is dead. It happened in the dead of night, not with the glorious roar of battle, but a whisper of poison, or perhaps the sudden, final vengeance of a broken heart. Uther Pendragon, the fiery dragon king who had stained his soul for Igraine, fell silent. His death was the starting pistol for chaos, a brutal, unforgiving race for the throne where every minor warlord suddenly remembered their distant, dubious claim to kingship. The crown, now sitting on a silken cushion in a dark vault, was the singular, irresistible magnet for every greedy, power-mad soul in Britain. They didn't mourn Uther. They measured his grave for a swift replacement. The fragile, unified kingdom Uther had clawed into existence was poised to shatter back into 1,000 warring fragments, ripe for Saxon conquest and total annihilation. The moment the crown slipped from Uther's cold brow, Britain dissolved into a screaming maelstrom of petty civil war. Barons seized castles, alliances fractured like cheap ice, and the entire dream of a unified realm, the dream Uther had died trying to preserve, was dissolving into the bloody mud of winter. Merlin, the architect of this entire cursed dynasty, understood the catastrophic stakes. If Arthur was not crowned immediately, the boy would be murdered before dawn, and his own magical reputation, his very life, would be forfeit. He needed not merely a crowning, but a spectacle so profound, so clearly touched by divine, terrifying power, that even the most cynical warlord would hesitate before drawing steel. Merlin called upon ancient, terrible energies, the true elemental magic that predated the gods of the church, to create the ultimate, undeniable proof of Arthur's destiny. The great lie needed the great miracle to survive. Christmas Day, London. The air was thick with the stench of wet wool, fear, and simmering rebellion. As the great lords gathered for a supposed funeral council, a meeting that was, in truth, a volatile audition for tyranny and a thinly veiled plot to carve up the kingdom, Merlin unleashed the final, most audacious piece of his magical machinery. In the paved square outside the greatest cathedral, a terrible, unmoving object materialized. It was a massive block of gray granite, ancient and dark, crowned with a heavy, pitted steel anvil that seemed to have been forged in the heart of a dying star, appearing as if torn from the very foundation of the earth itself. Driven deep into the anvil and then into the stone was a single, glorious, blindingly polished sword. This was not a weapon made by human hands. It hummed with contained energy, a terrifyingly beautiful light against the perpetual gloom of the Dark Ages. Etched in glowing, impossible gold letters around the hilt, visible to every single terrified, grasping lord, was the declaration that shook the very foundations of power. Whoso pulleth out this sword of this stone and anvil is rightwise king born of all England. The silence that followed was heavier than the stone itself, broken only by the rasping breath of ambitious men. Then the stampede began. These were the most powerful men in the land, battle-hardened tyrants whose hands were already slick with the blood of their rivals. They scorned the miracle as a trick, but the throne was too tempting to ignore. Duke after duke, earl after earl, they grabbed the hilt with avarice and rage, straining tendons and snapping bone, roaring with effort until their faces turned the color of bruised plums. They tried brute strength. They tried cunning. They even tried dark magic whispered from forgotten corners of the earth. But the sword refused to budge, rooted deeper than the mountains themselves, mocking their ambition, rejecting their tainted claims and their unworthy souls. The miracle was perfect in its cruelty. It judged them all wanting. After hours of humiliating failure, the lords retreated, sullen and defeated, their egos shattered, convinced Merlin was mocking them, but unable to deny the sheer immovable fact of the sword. They decided to postpone the challenge until the new year, hoping the wizard's power would wane or the stone would crumble. And then, into this scene of divine frustration and political failure, stumbles the boy destined to carry the weight of the crown, Arthur. He wasn't there to claim a kingdom or to prove his lineage. He was there because he was 12 years old, still legally a servant, and utterly terrified of incurring the wrath of his foster brother, Sir Kay. Arthur lived under the strict, watchful eye of his foster father, Sir Ector, a decent but unremarkable landed knight who had been given the boy under conditions of absolute secrecy by Merlin years before. Arthur's foster brother, Sir Kay, the boorish, entitled son of Ector, had forgotten his own sword back at the lodge and was about to enter a critical tournament. "Go back, boy," Kay commanded with typical disdain. "Fetch my steel, or you'll face the lash." Arthur, sprinting back to the deserted square where the great lords had gathered, saw the glittering sword in the stone, not as a test of divinity, but simply as a replacement tool, a quick fix for a pressing problem that would save him a beating. He grabbed the hilt, thinking only of Kay's impatience and the cold journey back to the lodge. There was no struggle, no strain, no dramatic flash of lightning. It slid out of the granite and the steel anvil as easily as a warm knife through melting butter. The silence this time was absolute, a cosmic pause button pressed on the entire world. Arthur looked at the shining blade in his hand, confused. Mission accomplished. He had Kay's sword. When he presented it to his brother, Kay, recognizing the impossible weapon, immediately seized the moment, attempting to claim the miracle as his own, lying shamelessly to Ector that he was the rightful king. But the truth, the shocking, inconvenient truth, could not be hidden. Ector, a man of simple honesty, made Arthur repeat the act. When the common-looking boy easily replaced the sword and then just as easily retrieved it again, the lords who had rushed back to witness the renewed spectacle finally understood the horrific, impossible truth. The king was chosen. The king was a child. The king was an illegitimate, low-born squire adopted by a minor knight. The reaction was not reverence. It was immediate, volcanic fury. How dare this wizard Merlin bypass centuries of noble bloodline and ancient tradition for a child who smelled of hay and saddle leather? The lords drew their swords, not in salute, but in pure, murderous rage. "Fraud!" they screamed. "Lies! We will never bow to a low-born whelp. This is a dark pact." The age of Arthur, the legendary era of Camelot and the Round Table, did not begin with a triumphant coronation, but with the threat of immediate, bloody execution, forcing Merlin and the young, bewildered King Arthur to flee for their lives into the shadows of the British wilderness. The real war for the soul of Britain had just begun, and the boy held the only weapon that mattered. The earth did not merely shake when Uther Pendragon fell, it shattered. His death was the starting gun for anarchy, a gruesome Olympic sprint where the prize was the fractured crown of Britain. The powerful yet deeply flawed king was gone, leaving behind a power vacuum so violent it threatened to swallow the island whole. This was the true Dark Age, the abyss between the fading Roman glory and the birth of a unified nation. The air was thick with the scent of fear, betrayal, and burning villages. Arthur, the infant king, was now the most hunted soul in the entire kingdom, a walking target marked by the very blood flowing in his veins. But the great sorcerer, the puppet master who had orchestrated the king's conception, was already several moves ahead on the chessboard of fate. Merlin knew Arthur's true identity was a death sentence waiting to be signed by a dozen jealous rivals. The boy could not be raised in a castle gleaming with false promises. He had to vanish completely. And so began the legend of the Hidden King. Merlin took the royal infant, wrapped in swaddling clothes that smelled less of lavender and more of destiny, and spirited him away under the thick, protective cloak of the deepest night. He was not heading for a friendly court. He was heading for oblivion, for the most dangerous place a prince could hide: plain sight. The destination was a small, fortified manor belonging to a loyal, though minor, nobleman, Sir Ector. Ector was an honorable man, a pillar of the old ways, a figure of strength and principle, but crucially, he was a man far removed from the poisonous central politics of the warring courts. He and his own son, Kay, would raise the future King of Britain not as a pampered prince, but as a humble squire, a stable boy, a common lad forged in the grime and hardship of the era. Merlin exacted a terrible oath from Ector, an oath sealed by blood and the oldest magic, that Arthur's true, catastrophic parentage would never, under any circumstance, be revealed until the destined hour of reckoning arrived. This was not a soft life for a king. This was the ultimate training. This was the dark forge where a legend was hammered into shape, away from the silk and the sycophants. Arthur was taught the painful reality of service, the necessity of humility, and the brutal efficiency of a sword in the face of sudden danger. He knew nothing of his mother, Igraine, the queen seduced by sorcery, nor of his volatile, lust-driven father, Uther Pendragon. He simply believed he was the lesser son of Ector, perpetually living in the shadow of the true heir, the older, often arrogant, and fiercely demanding Sir Kay. For nearly 16 years, Arthur lived in the shadows. He learned to wield a sword not for sport or ceremony, but for desperate survival against the savage border raids and the constant threat of banditry that plagued the increasingly lawless roads. He learned to manage a horse, clean armor, and endure the stinging, often unfair criticisms of his foster brother. While he toiled in the dirt, polishing the steel of his presumed superiors, the island outside Ector's protective walls was burning down around them. The Saxon tide, initially invited by the Britons themselves to fight other encroaching barbarians, had turned into a catastrophic, relentless invasion. Hengist and Horsa's descendants, the Jutes, the Angles, they were conquering everything, pushing the native Britons further and further into the desolate western mountains and the coastal strongholds. The British warlords, instead of uniting against this clear and present existential threat, spent their precious time tearing each other apart over land rights, old grudges, and cattle rustling. The land cried out with a voice that echoed across the ruined Roman roads, desperate for a king, a dux bellorum, a unifying war leader who could consolidate the fractured tribes. But the only legitimate heir was scrubbing muck off of Sir Kay's boots, completely unaware that the fate of the entire collapsing civilization rested squarely on his inexperienced teenage shoulders. Years passed like brutal, unforgiving winters. Arthur grew strong, disciplined, and fiercely loyal to the family that had sheltered him, enduring Kay's challenging, often cruel behavior with the stoic patience of a seasoned soldier. Meanwhile, the British nobles held endless, fruitless councils in crumbling halls, arguing viciously over who had the strongest, most dubious ancestral claim to the sacred Pendragon throne. They searched frantically for Uther's rumored bastard son, the mysterious child Merlin had hidden, but the sorcerer's secrecy was absolute, impenetrable. The kingdom was undeniably failing, collapsing into a dark abyss, simply because the crown had no head, the sacred spear had no guiding hand, and the old ways of succession had been violently broken by Uther's deception. Then, finally, when hope was almost entirely extinguished, when the Saxon vanguard was pressing with full force against the very gates of the western territories, threatening the final fatal push, Merlin made his devastating move. The time for hiding the truth was terrifyingly over. The time for the divine sign, the impossible, undeniable proof of lineage, had finally arrived. He commissioned a spectacular, undeniable miracle, designed not just to identify the true king, but to force the most arrogant, established lords to bow before a commoner, a nobody. This was the great sorcerer's final, magnificent, and utterly terrifying gamble. He needed a symbol of undeniable, heaven-sent legitimacy that no sword or shield, no army or ancestor could dare to contest. The stage was meticulously set in the capital, a massive, desperate congregation of all the desperate lords and bishops, gathered under a sky heavy with dread and the smoke of distant battles. And in the center of the city square, bathed in an ethereal, otherworldly light that defied the gloom, appeared the challenge that would change the course of British history forever. It was a sight so impossible, so clearly marked by the decisive, authoritative hand of God, or perhaps the terrible hand of the devil's agent Merlin, that every man present froze in awe and absolute terror. Driven impossibly deep into an anvil of solid, unyielding stone, waiting patiently for the worthy man to claim it, was the ultimate, inescapable sign of sovereignty, the sword in the stone. The air turned to ash the moment Uther Pendragon's last ragged breath abandoned his royal lungs. The king was gone, and instantly the fragile peace he had enforced, a peace built on the bones of conquered tribes and the catastrophic lie of Arthur's birth, shattered like glass dropped from a great height. Every minor duke, every petty chieftain, every warlord who ever dreamed of a gilded crown saw this as their moment of volcanic ascension, their chance to seize the poisoned chalice of Britain's throne. The Roman legions were long gone, leaving behind only crumbling roads and the ghosts of order. And now the Saxon tide was creeping in, licking at the shores, sensing the weakness at the core of the fractured isle. Britain, the land Arthur was born to rule, was dying under the weight of its own ambition and treachery, drowning in a sea of bloodlust and political maneuvering that threatened to wipe out the last vestiges of civilized life. But Merlin, the architect of destiny and the master manipulator of fate, was already several moves ahead on the grim chessboard of sovereignty. He knew the child Arthur, raised in complete, ignorant anonymity under the stern but loving guardianship of Sir Ector, was the only key to preventing total annihilation, the only man capable of forging a true kingdom from this desperate, barbaric mess. The boy was now a young man, strong and keen, but utterly unaware that the blood of Pendragon flowed through his veins, or that his very existence was a magical betrayal that cost his true mother her life. Merlin moved through the shadows of the warring courts, spreading whispers of a coming miracle, a sign from the ancient gods and the Christian father alike that would define the rightful ruler. He called for a great assembly, a massive tournament held during the sacred time of Christmas in the greatest city remaining, a city that would one day be known as London, luring every ambitious, greedy lord to one central spot where their destiny could be decided or violently denied. The lords arrived in a tempest of rattling chainmail and arrogant banners. They came not in devotion, but in expectation of battle, ready to stab each other in the back while pretending to celebrate the Christian feast with feigned piety. Knights from Cornwall, the northern marches, and the harsh Welsh frontiers descended upon the city, their eyes sharp with avarice, and their hands never far from their sword hilts, each convinced that divine favor smiled only upon their specific, selfish bloodline. Then, in the midst of the main cathedral square, the miracle manifested exactly as the terrifying prophet had foretold, a perfect, inescapable trap for their ambition. There stood a colossal block of polished black marble, an unyielding altar of stone, an anvil ripped from the heart of the earth itself, and thrust impossibly deep into its core was the symbol that instantly silenced the entire clamoring, arrogant crowd: the sword. It was not merely a weapon, it was a promise, a binding contract with destiny, demanding not just brute strength, but absolute, inherent, divine right. Etched into the stone base, glowing faintly with an internal, icy light that seemed to burn with eternal judgment, were the words that sealed the fate of the entire realm. Whosoever pulleth this sword from this stone is rightwise king, born of all England. The moment the proclamation was read by a nervous, trembling cleric, the pretense of piety instantly vanished. The square erupted into a primal, desperate surge, a tide of ambition rushing toward the stone with terrifying speed. The mightiest, heaviest, most battle-hardened man present, a giant named Sir Belligus, whose reputation was built on broken skulls and shattered shields, pushed his way through the desperate throng, flexing muscles like woven steel cables, desperate for the crown. He took the hilt, spat on his hands in a crude gesture of power, and strained against the unyielding object. His face turned a dangerous, alarming shade of purple. Veins bulged on his neck like whipcords, and the tendons in his arms threatened to snap under the monumental pressure he exerted. The marble altar trembled slightly, the ground groaned beneath his iron boots from the force, but the sword refused to move, remaining rooted, utterly and profoundly unmoved, mocking his brutal strength. He failed, and his failure was the signal for dozens of others to try, each man more arrogant and desperate than the last. One after another, the proudest, most powerful men in Britain, the very lords who believed their brutal heritage guaranteed them the throne, pulled and twisted and roared in furious exertion, fueled by their burning need for sovereignty. They used leverage, they wrapped leather straps around the hilt for extra grip, they tried every physical trick known to warfare and siegecraft, but the result was always the same: catastrophic, humiliating failure. The sword remained defiantly entombed. The air grew thick with frustration, turning the initial awe into bitter resentment and deep-seated suspicion. The lords started to accuse each other of witchcraft, of sabotage, of hiding the true mechanism that would release the prize, their paranoia threatening to spill into open, armed conflict right there in the cathedral square. Amidst this royal, deadly chaos, there moved a young man of unassuming grace, whose only concern was fulfilling his mundane duties to his foster family. This was Arthur, the unnoticed son of the great betrayal, serving as squire to his older, boisterous foster brother, Sir Kay. Sir Ector had brought Kay to the city, hoping he might win honor in the Christmas jousts, completely blind to the terrifying Pendragon destiny held by the boy carrying his shield and armor. On the day of the grand tournament, the stands were packed, the trumpets blared, and the tension was so sharp you could slice it with a dagger. Sir Kay, preparing for his match, suddenly realized with a gasp of horror that he had forgotten the essential tool of his trade, his sword. It was the moment of destiny disguised as a domestic crisis. "Arthur!" he barked, his voice sharp with annoyance and panic. "You fool! I left my good sword back at the lodging. Go! Run! If I miss this joust because of your incompetence, I'll have you whipped until you bleed. Now hurry!" Arthur, driven only by the deep, ingrained loyalty drilled into him by Ector, the only loyalty he had ever known, sprinted back across the city streets, dodging vendors and drunken knights. He reached their rented dwelling only to find the door bolted, the family having rushed out to see the spectacle. Panic seized him. His brother needed a blade, and the window of the challenge was closing rapidly, meaning disgrace for Kay. He looked around, desperately seeking a solution, a replacement blade, and that is when his eyes, in a moment of pure, innocent chance, fell upon the silent, imposing spectacle in the deserted square, the great stone, the anvil, and the sword that no king could touch. It was unguarded, because every lord and every commoner believed that brute force had failed, and therefore the task was impossible. They were all at the jousting lists, watching for a different kind of victory. Arthur's mind did not process destiny or prophecy. It was not arrogance that guided his feet. It was sheer practical necessity. Arthur did not see the terrible magic etched into the stone. He saw a spare sword, temporarily misplaced, available for immediate use by his demanding older brother. He walked up to the massive block, took the hilt, a simple leather-wrapped grip, without any of the grunts, strains, or histrionic theatrics displayed by the muscle-bound lords of the realm. He didn't brace his feet. He didn't adjust his grip. He simply needed a sword. And with a movement as smooth and effortless as drawing a knife from a sheath, Arthur Pendragon, the illegitimate, hidden king of Britain, pulled the sword from the stone. There was no thunderclap, no celestial choir, no earthquake. There was only the gentle, smooth sigh of metal leaving its eternal prison. The prophecy, sealed by magic and betrayal decades earlier, was finally, irrevocably fulfilled. The sound was so quiet, so totally unexpected, that Arthur himself barely registered the magnitude of what he had accomplished, hurrying off to give the blade to his brother, completely ignorant that he had just claimed the shattered throne of Britain. Breathless, utterly focused only on the task of mitigating his brother's inconvenience, the boy Arthur raced back across the tournament grounds, the magnificent, shining sword held awkwardly in his hand. He was completely oblivious to the fact that the entire roaring landscape of British anarchy was about to shatter around him, all because of the polished steel he held. He found Sir Kay, sweating and cursing, finally having retrieved the necessary scabbard, only to look up and see the solution to his problem already delivered into the hands of his younger adopted brother. Kay's eyes went wide, not with relief, but with a terrifying sudden flash of pure, unadulterated ambition. He recognized the sword. Its craftsmanship was unlike anything known in the fractured kingdoms, and the pieces of the puzzle slammed together in his greedy mind. Kay instantly understood where Arthur must have retrieved it, and in that volcanic moment, he decided to claim the destiny that was never meant for him. "Arthur, you idiot! Where did you get that?" Kay demanded, snatching the blade and examining it with a feigned proprietary awe. "Father, Ector, look! I have the sword! I did it! I am the king!" Sir Ector, the humble knight who had raised Arthur for 16 years, who had loved him as his own son while bearing the catastrophic secret of his true parentage, felt the blood drain from his face. He stared at the blade, then at his arrogant, lying biological son, and finally, his gaze settled on the innocent, slightly confused face of Arthur. The years of silence, the oaths sworn to a vengeful Merlin, the heavy weight of Uther Pendragon's final command, all of it crashed down upon him. The truth was out, forced into the light by a boy's simple act of kindness. This was the moment of reckoning he had always dreaded. Ector did not rebuke Kay. He didn't need to. He simply looked at the boy who was now claiming the throne and said, his voice a low, terrifying rumble, "You will not lie about this, Kay. Where did you truly get this blade? Answer me, or suffer the consequences of divine judgment." Kay, unable to meet his father's eyes under the weight of such an accusation, faltered and then pointed weakly at Arthur, muttering that his brother had brought it to him. The lie was exposed, but the greater truth remained veiled. Ector knew what he had to do. The people needed proof, irrefutable evidence that defied all mortal comprehension, or the delicate peace would evaporate into civil war. They must return to the stone. Under the growing, morbid silence of the assembling crowd, Sir Ector, Kay, and Arthur rode back to the cathedral yard. The massive block of gray marble, now bearing the faint indentation where the sword had rested, stood like a silent witness to the miracle. Ector commanded Arthur to place the sword back into the anvil, and Arthur, still just trying to obey his father's strange requests, slid the blade effortlessly back into its lodging. It sank deep into the stone as if passing through warm water, locking instantly and utterly, defying physics and the laws of the earth. The crowd, which had followed, gasped as one. Then came the test of the pretenders. Ector insisted that Kay try first, forcing the humbled young man to grasp the hilt and pull with all his strength. Kay strained, his face turning crimson, his muscles bulging uselessly against the immovable object. The sword did not budge. Ector himself, a powerful, battle-hardened knight, tried next, throwing his entire weight and experience into the effort. The stone merely mocked him with its absolute inertia. The blade was sealed, awaiting its true owner, a stark, metal judge over the ambitions of mortals. Finally, Ector looked at Arthur, his gaze now filled with a crushing mix of terror and reverence, and simply nodded. "Pull it, Arthur." Arthur, seeing no difficulty, placed his hand lightly on the familiar hilt. He paused only to look around at the hundreds of eyes fixed on him, the silence so heavy it felt like stone itself. He drew the blade, not with effort, but with the fluid motion of unsheathing a sword from a leather scabbard. It came out clean, the ancient metal singing a sharp, clear note in the suddenly charged air. The sword of destiny had confirmed its master. It was in this moment, witnessing the undeniable, repeated miracle, that Sir Ector understood his oath was fulfilled, and the gravity of his mission was over. The man who had been his son's guardian was now the subject of his king. Ector dropped to his knees in the dust, the noise of his armor hitting the ground echoing like a gunshot in the stunned silence. He bowed his head, a single, devastating word escaping his lips. "My lord." Arthur, seeing his beloved father figure kneeling before him, felt a wave of shock and panic. "Father, what are you doing? Get up! Why are you kneeling?" he pleaded, bewildered by the sudden, terrifying change in Ector's demeanor. It was then, amidst the awestruck whispers of the slowly awakening crowd, that Ector spoke the words Arthur had never been meant to hear. He revealed the secret of Tintagel, the deception of Merlin, the brutal lust of Uther, and the terrible night of his birth. He explained that this sword, this sign, proved that the bastard boy he had raised was not just a king, but the king, the true, rightful heir to the shattered throne of Britain. Arthur Pendragon was no longer a simple squire. He was the focus of all divine and political power, whether he wanted it or not. The sudden, unwanted weight of destiny crushed the youth out of him. The immediate reaction was not adoration, but a furious, entitled rejection. The barons and dukes, the high nobility of Britain, men who had traveled great distances to claim the sword for themselves, were not about to let an unknown, unproven boy, raised in obscurity, usurp their power. They exploded in outrage, their voices a synchronized roar of feudal entitlement. "This is a trick, a peasant's magic. He is a common bastard. We will not be ruled by a boy." The air was instantly thick with threats and volatile ambition. The nobles demanded the test be repeated again and again and again, hoping the magic would fail, hoping the boy would bleed, hoping they could delegitimize the miracle before it could solidify into political fact. They refused to accept the crowning. Every time the blade was pulled, proving Arthur's divine right, the nobles merely postponed the coronation, demanding more time to consider the implications, though their intent was clear, to muster their armies and crush the upstart before he could gather any strength. The sword had given Arthur the title, but it had not given him the power, nor the army necessary to enforce his claim. Britain was plunged back into a cycle of brutal, short skirmishes, a constant low-grade warfare where every minor noble saw an opportunity for regicide. Arthur was crowned, formally, on the Feast of Pentecost, but even then the powerful lords refused to attend, retreating to their strongholds to plot their rebellion. It was into this boiling cauldron of betrayal and entitlement that Merlin finally stepped out of the shadows. The wizard, who had carefully choreographed every moment of Arthur's life since the night he was conceived, now emerged as the boy king's chief strategist and protector. Merlin had ensured the sword would be irrefutable proof, and now he had to ensure the boy survived the inevitable onslaught. He stood before the rebellious nobles, his voice cracking with unnatural power, laying bare the history of Uther, the prophecies, and the divine mandate. He forced the unwilling lords to confront the devastating truth. Arthur was the legitimate king, whether they bowed willingly or were crushed beneath the future might of Camelot. The fight for the crown had just begun, and the boy who pulled the sword would have to spend the next several years pulling the necessary blood from the land to secure his shattering claim. The moment Arthur Pendragon, the boy who should have been a stable hand, the boy whose very existence was a magical cheat code engineered by a desperate king and a terrifying sorcerer, laid his hand on the hilt of Excalibur, the whole of Britain erupted, not in cheers, but in a chorus of murderous rage. The great lie of his birth, the secret of Uther and Igraine's night of betrayal, was momentarily drowned out by the metallic ring of the sword against the stone, but the political fallout was immediate and catastrophic. The powerful, entrenched kings and chieftains who had been patiently waiting for the dust of Uther's reign to settle, the men who truly believed they held the genetic right to the throne, did not see a rightful heir. They saw a usurper, an impostor, a magical puppet placed on the stage by the mad manipulations of the wizard Merlin. This was not a coronation. This was an invasion of their ancient rights. And they were not about to bow their heads to a boy whose father they barely tolerated, and whose mother was now a ghost of history. The ink on the Declaration of Sovereignty was still wet when the first war horn sounded across the fractured landscape, signaling the beginning of the most brutal civil war Britain had ever endured. Merlin, the architect of this entire terrifying saga, knew that magic alone could not hold a kingdom. The sword was a symbol, but steel was the currency of the Dark Ages, and Arthur held very little of it. He had bought Arthur a moment of stunned silence from the populace, but that crucial moment was expiring faster than dry tinder in a furnace, and the lords of the north were already gathering their hardened, battle-scarred legions. The Wizards' Council turned immediately to war calculus, the cold, hard math of survival. Arthur had to demonstrate that the divine right symbolized by the stone could be brutally enforced by the sharp edge of the blade, or he would be dead before the summer harvest. Merlin's deep contacts, the few remaining loyalists from Uther's shattered court, the lesser lords hoping to claw their way up the feudal ladder, and the few mercenary captains whose loyalty was bought strictly with gold, were now Arthur's embryonic army. But these were meager forces against the unified might of kings like Lot of Lothian and King Urien of Gore, men who commanded respect, legions of hardened tribesmen, and ancient, unshakable claims to the Pendragon legacy. The coalition of the northern kings formed instantly, their purpose singular and devastating: crush the pretender before his legend could take root and before he could gather the necessary resources. The first years of Arthur's reign were not spent designing round tables or debating chivalry. They were spent in the mud and blood of ceaseless, savage campaigning, fighting for the very right to breathe. The boy king was immediately thrust into the forge of war, forced to learn command not in theory, but in the sickening reality of blade meeting bone and the scream of dying men. His enemies mocked his youth, calling him the boy king and the puppet of the sorcerer, using his dubious lineage as a weapon to demoralize his small band of followers. But Arthur possessed a terrifying, inherent military genius, perhaps inherited from the fiery, ruthless temper of Uther, or perhaps simply gifted by the destiny Merlin had manufactured. The early battles were desperate, close-run affairs, often fought against overwhelming odds, requiring bold maneuvers and terrifying risks that bordered on suicidal recklessness. Merlin, standing like a shadowy general behind the young king, fed him critical intelligence, predicting troop movements and exploiting ancient rivalries between the rebel factions like a grand master playing a bloody game of chess. This wasn't fair fighting. This was survival, wrapped in strategy and powered by the desperate urgency of a man who knew failure meant not just abdication, but immediate, gruesome death. Arthur's most critical early victories came in a relentless pushback against the initial rebel surge, culminating in a campaign that history often simplifies into the legendary Battle of Badon Hill. King Lot, a seasoned warrior hardened by decades of border skirmishes against the encroaching Saxon tide, fatally underestimated the psychological impact of Arthur's presence and the terrifying momentum of a truly unified, if small, force fighting under a seemingly magical banner. The rebels were fighting a man. Arthur was fighting a symbol of divine intervention. In the chaos of those dark years, Arthur demonstrated a profound, almost chilling ability to inspire fanatic loyalty among his growing band of followers, men who would become the foundational core of the Knights of the Round Table. They believed in the sword, they believed in the promise of stability, and they believed in the terrifying competence of the wizard who guided their master's hand from the shadows. The land of Britain was a patchwork quilt of jealous fiefdoms, and Arthur quickly realized he couldn't rule from a tent on a battlefield forever. Stability required infrastructure. He needed a center of power, a place where his nascent court could operate, a bastion that screamed permanence and defiance to his enemies. This is where the legend of Camelot truly began, not as a utopian dream, but as a heavily fortified, strategic necessity, placed deliberately in a defensible, central position relative to the volatile territories he needed to control. Merlin oversaw the construction with the ruthless efficiency of a man building a fortress against a coming, inevitable storm. Massive stone walls rose, not by magic alone, but by the back-breaking labor of conscripted commoners and the forced levies of conquered lords, creating a formidable keep. Camelot was, in its infancy, a siege weapon pointed squarely at the heart of the northern resistance. The cost was astronomical, the suffering immense, but the result was undeniable. Arthur had planted his banner in the ground, and it was rooted deep in the very bedrock of the island. He had survived the initial volcanic eruption of the nobility. He had proven that the boy king could command men and win battles, but the most dangerous enemy was still lurking just beneath the surface of his victory. The secret of his own birth, a political time bomb ticking beneath the nascent foundations of his kingdom. The kingdom was built on the shaky promise of a miraculous sword, enforced by the brutality of endless war, and sustained by the dark strategic counsel of the man who orchestrated the original, sinful conception. Now, the time had come to seek not just steel, but alliances, and Arthur would soon look across the sea to forge a bond with the legendary Guinevere, a union meant to solidify his realm, but destined to ignite the very fires that would eventually consume it all. The whispers had already begun to traverse the damp, fog-choked valleys of Britain long before the royal wedding bells ever dared to ring. Arthur, the young king whose very existence was a magical secret, now needed more than just a legendary sword to hold his fractured kingdom together. He needed a political anchor, an unbreakable chain forged in the heat of alliance, and that chain had a name: Guinevere. She was the daughter of King Leodegrance of Camelot, a powerful chieftain whose legions controlled critical southern territories, a man whose loyalty could swing the balance of power across the entire island. To wed Guinevere was not merely to gain a wife, it was to absorb an army, to inherit strategic fortresses, and to finally silence the perpetually barking dogs of territorial dispute that haunted Arthur's borders. The stakes were astronomical. Yet Arthur, ever the pragmatist forged in war, approached the union not with romantic ideals, but with the grim determination of a man securing his legacy against the violent chaos of the Dark Ages. The stability of Britain demanded this marriage, even if his heart, or hers, had to be sacrificed upon the altar of political necessity. The wedding itself was an event of unbelievable, almost sacrilegious opulence for the brutal 5th century. Imagine the raw, savage land suddenly illuminated by silks, gold, and the deafening clanging of ceremonial armor, all converging on the nascent fortress that Arthur was building, Camelot. Merlin, the shadowy puppet master, ensured every detail was steeped in potent, ancient symbolism, crafting a narrative of divine authority that Arthur, the son of deceit, desperately needed to project. The people were awestruck, mesmerized by the sheer scale of the vision, a true seat of civilization rising from the mud and blood of the Dark Ages. This celebration was more than a party. It was a deliberate, magnificent act of propaganda designed to shatter the minds of the dissenting barons and intimidate the encroaching Saxon hordes. "Look upon our splendor," the spectacle declared, "and tremble." But Leodegrance did not just bring armies and dowry. He brought the legendary centerpiece, the physical embodiment of Arthur's radical new idea of governance, the Round Table itself. This was no ordinary piece of furniture. It was a declaration of war against the feudal hierarchy that had defined Britain for centuries. No head, no sides, just a perfectly engineered circle where every knight, regardless of their noble lineage or the size of their landholdings, sat equal to the king. This concept was revolutionary, utterly terrifying to the established barons who cherished their elevated seating arrangements and the deference they demanded from those below them. Arthur knew that only radical unity, a shared sense of ultimate mission, could hold back the Saxon tide that was relentlessly crashing against their shores and the internal squabbles that threatened to tear the fragile kingdom apart. The Round Table was the spiritual anchor of a nation, founded on an oath of absolute equality and honor. The oaths sworn around that table were not pleasant parlor promises. They were blood-curdling vows of loyalty, honor, and selfless pursuit of justice, often taken under the terrifying watchful eye of Merlin, who knew exactly how to twist a man's fate with a single whispered prophecy. Guinevere, the newly crowned queen, was stunning, yes, but she was also a woman of fierce political intellect, accustomed to command, not simply to stand as a beautiful accessory. She understood the weight of her position. She was the living covenant between the two greatest powers in Britain, and the pressure of maintaining that delicate balance rested squarely on her shoulders. Her intelligence was undeniable, her beauty legendary, but her role was isolating. Arthur, the warrior king, was constantly riding the lightning edge of battle, ensuring the very peace that allowed Camelot to flourish and the Round Table to hold its council. This left Guinevere, young, vibrant, and powerful, essentially alone in a court buzzing with ambitious men, all gazing upon the king's prize with varying degrees of reverence and lust. The vacuum of Arthur's constant absence was a danger far greater than any open rebellion. The legend, now cemented by this marriage and the glorious sight of Camelot rising, demanded a perfect champion, a knight so impossibly skilled, so breathtakingly honorable, that he would become the gold standard against which all others were measured. The kingdom needed a symbol of its own perfection. And as the kingdom grew, swelling with pride and power, so too did the need for an ultimate guardian, a true embodiment of the chivalric ideal that Arthur was desperately trying to force into the savage world. The tales of a mysterious figure began to drift across the narrow seas, a knight from the continent, specifically from Gaul, modern France, whose prowess in the tournament field and whose devout sense of chivalry bordered on the supernatural. This man was Sir Lancelot of the Lake, the physical manifestation of every ideal the Round Table stood for, and his impending arrival was the most anticipated event in all of Arthurian history. He was the perfect, shining shield that Camelot was waiting for. Merlin had seen the prophecy, of course, a terrifying vision of absolute glory intertwined with absolute ruin, a beautiful, impossible paradox. Lancelot was destined to be Arthur's greatest friend, his ultimate protector, the embodiment of Camelot's golden age. But destiny, that cruel, cosmic trickster, had woven a second, devastating thread into Lancelot's fate. He was also destined to be the ruin of the king, the irresistible temptation to the queen, and the catalyst for the final, bloody implosion of everything Arthur had built. The stage was set. The king had his crown, the queen her power, and the kingdom its fragile peace. All it needed now was the introduction of one single, impossibly flawless man to shatter the peace forever and ignite the darkest fire in Guinevere's isolated heart. The greatest love triangle in all of Western mythology was not a quiet domestic squabble. It was a ticking political time bomb wrapped in the shimmering cloth of chivalry, ready to detonate the golden age of Camelot from the inside out and bring the glorious deception to its knees.